Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 870 for May 10th, 2021. Coming up in a few minutes.
The education part is trying to, without boring people, because I'm obviously very aware that when we're doing a whiskey tasting, probably 80% of the room is there for the whiskey and not to be told how blockchain works. So it's more about trying to talk about it in layman's terms, trying to make it a very friendly way of getting information that they want out of each bottle.
This week, whiskey meets technology. And we're not talking about those high-tech methods for making whiskey that appears to be older than it really is. In fact, it's the exact opposite, giving us a way to verify that whiskeys are actually what they claim to be years from now by using blockchain technology. Admittedly, when it comes to understanding blockchain, well, I'm a bit of a blockhead. Fortunately, Chris Ratcliff is not. He'll introduce us to the use of blockchain by whiskey makers on this week's WhiskyCast In-Depth. We'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, Your Voice, and on Behind the Label, we'll dive head first into the debate over the neck pour.
The idea that somehow like whiskey at the top of the bottle is going to be like different than, but when you pour it out, like how are you maintaining perfectly laminar separation in the process of tilting a whiskey bottle? I don't see it.
The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
After 175 years in business, Dewar's could rest on its laurels. But we've always believed in staying curious, which brings us to Portuguese Smooth, the brainchild of our award-winning master blender, Stephanie McLeod. Portuguese Smooth is a high-quality blended scotch finished in real ruby port barrels for a taste like no other.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Robin Redbreast? You may have seen me around. Face label, label face. Yeah, that's the one. I'm now contractually obligated to be their spokesbird. Yeah, my agent didn't read the small print.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Let's get started with the news, and we have to start with politics again. Specifically, the tariffs that the European Union and Great Britain have been imposing on American whiskey imports since 2018. Those tariffs were to retaliate for the Trump administration's decision to slap tariffs on imports of European steel and aluminum, and they're scheduled to double from 25% to 50% 3 weeks from now. Over the last 3 years, those tariffs have cost U.S. distilleries millions of dollars in lost sales, and while the Biden administration has been discussing the global steel oversupply problem with its counterparts in Europe, there has been no talk in Washington of actually removing the steel and aluminum tariffs. As a result, it's getting more and more likely that the European and UK tariffs will double as planned on June 1st. Catoctin Creek's Becky Harris is the president of the American Craft Spirits Association.
American whiskey has been so influential and it has been such a source of inspiration, in many categories, whether it be bourbon or rye, for producers all over the world. And what we have as a country have chosen to do is drag these exports in the middle of an unrelated trade dispute and cripple the growth of a agricultural export for probably the next 10 to 15 years, because in the interim, while we do this to our product and get this product in here, in the middle of this dispute, what we're doing is we're giving the rest of the world time to create their own versions of some of our signature spirits and to become as excited and passionate about them as they were originally about some of our original exports. And I think that's really unfortunate. All we ask is the opportunity to bring our spirits to the world on a level playing field. And right now, because of the issues with steel and aluminum, that is not being afforded to us, and it's hurting small businesses around the country.
Becky Harris told us Friday night on the Happy Hour live webcast that there is some hope British officials might be willing to negotiate a way out of the increase. Prime Minister Boris Johnson inherited the tariffs when the UK finally left the European Union back on New Year's Day. He had pledged in his last election campaign that he would end the whiskey tariffs if re-elected, since it has resulted in higher prices and fewer choices for UK residents. But so far, he has not followed up on that pledge. And full disclosure, Catoctin Creek is a sponsor of WhiskyCast. Now, when the Biden administration's American Rescue Plan became law, it included more than $25 billion in COVID-19 relief aid for the hospitality industry through the Restaurants Act. While distilleries are eligible to receive aid to help with the loss of income caused by mandatory closings of their tasting rooms during the pandemic, that money is just now barely starting to trickle out. Phil McDaniel of Florida's St. Augustine Distillery chairs the Distilled Spirits Council's Craft Advisory Panel. He told us many of his colleagues are still trying to get through all of the paperwork.
There's so many, craft distillers who are very small in their production, and they rely so much on their tasting room. And, I always talk about the 4 values of a bottle, right? I mean, it costs you whatever it costs you to make that bottle of whiskey or bourbon or whatever you're making. And then, for a small producer, the most valuable way for us to monetize that is to make 17 cocktails from that bottle. If you can turn that into, $150 to $200, that's a whole lot better than, having it be a $50 retailer on a shelf and then getting 25 and then, obviously having to support that. So it's very, very important that these tasting rooms get open soon. And, hopefully, that'll happen around the country.
And as you might expect, there are already some distilleries finding that they will not be eligible for federal help because of red tape. For instance, distilleries in the state of Washington are caught in a conflict between federal and state laws. The state says distilleries can only make 30% of their annual profits from on-site sales each year. But to qualify for the federal grants from the Small Business Administration's Restaurant Revitalization Fund, they have to make at least 33% of their profits from on-site sales. The Seattle Times reports Washington Distillers Guild leaders are working with the state's congressional delegation to push for a change in the federal regulations. In other news, Diageo has wrapped up work on upgrades to the Visitors Center at Clynelish Distillery in the Scottish Highlands. It's the second of the 4 distilleries that will be part of the Johnny Walker Four Corners of Scotland project that dovetails with the new Johnny Walker Experience set to open soon in Edinburgh, and it also dovetails with the reopening of Brora Distillery across the road this month. Cardew's Visitors Center reopens next month after its upgrades, while construction delays caused by the COVID-19 pandemic have delayed work at Kalila Distillery on Isla. Heaven Hill is wrapping up the renovation of its flagship Visitors Center in Bardstown, Kentucky. What's been known for nearly 2 decades as the Bourbon Heritage Center is getting a new name along with the expansion. It'll be known now as the Heaven Hill Bourbon Experience. Jeff Crow is in charge of Heaven Hill's Visitors Centers.
Our grand opening ribbon cutting is June 14th. And what's special about that day, June 14th, is also National Bourbon Day. So we will cut the ribbon that morning to open our doors to all the new offerings that we will have, from a rooftop bar area called Five Brothers Bar and Kitchen to brand new educational galleries that include Larceny, Elijah Craig, Bottled & Bond, talks about the Shapira family. And of course, the most exciting thing we're offering is the You Do Bourbon space. And if you don't know what You Do Bourbon means, it's exactly what it sounds like. You will get to taste 4 products that are unique to that facility that you'll find only at that facility. And you'll then get the opportunity to bottle it and cork it and personalize label it and then purchase it. So that is a really cool concept that no one else on the Kentucky Bourbon Trail is doing at this point, and you'll get to do a hands-on lab experience at the end of that.
What are you expecting in terms of visitor traffic this year as we come out of COVID?
We have seen we are rebounding very quickly. And the governor had put out a statement today that we are hoping that social distancing will also go away as the 75% increase goes into effect on May the 28th. So if that's the case, we expect our rebound to take off very quickly. We open every morning in our Bardstown facility with a line of 25 to 50 people already outside waiting to get in. We still are following all the safety protocol that we have been given to do, the masks, hand sanitization, the sanitizing of the property as needed. But we're still seeing the demand. We're probably already booked 8 to 12 weeks in advance currently with the things that we are able to offer. So we know the business is there, and we know that people are still as in love with Kentucky bourbon today as they were a year ago.
Now, it's been almost 8 years since Evan Hill opened the Evan Williams Bourbon Experience on Main Street in downtown Louisville and really kicked off the boom in bourbon tourism downtown. Charlie Downs and Jody Filiatro have led a small team that runs the experience's on-site micro-distillery, and now the bourbon from that distillery is being bottled for the first time. Square 6 by Evan Williams gets its name from the original designation for the land where Evan Williams built his original distillery in 1783 and where the bourbon experience sits today. As Jeff Crow puts it, both of those distilleries probably made about the same amount of whiskey each day.
Our main plant makes 1,300 barrels per day. At our artisanal distillery, we make 1 barrel per day. It is all handcrafted. Everything that happens in that process is hand done. So nothing is processed or automated.
Is this from the first barrels that were filled that Charlie and Jody and the team filled when the place opened up? Or what's the story behind this?
It is not the first barrels that we filled. Heaven Hill is very much about the level of quality and not actually the age statement. So this is a 5-year expression. This is from some of the later products that we did about 2.5 years into us being open. Charlie started the process with us, but we felt like this was the best taste profile of the products we had for what we were looking for this very first release. So it is only a 5-year-old.
So what are you doing with those older barrels? You're going to let those sit for a bit?
Yeah, so we're going to let those sit. You know how we do that. Every couple of months we'll do a tasting in those to see where they fit on our plan, on our strategy for the next product. So, we don't have a set project for those as of yet.
Square 6 is a high rye bourbon bottled at 47.5% ABV. It'll be available at the Evan Williams Bourbon Experience and a handful of Kentucky retailers for $89.99 a bottle. The National Hockey League's Stanley Cup playoffs get underway later this week, and we have new whiskeys from a couple of Hockey Hall of Fame goalies to talk about. This one won't be out until later in the fall, but the next release in J.P. Weiser's NHL Alumni Series will feature Martin Brodeur. He's the first goalie to be featured in the series, and Dr. Don Livermore broke the news during Saturday night's Hockey Night in Canada tasting of the Alumni Series with the Ottawa Whisky Guild.
It's got some Canadian, and obviously he's got French roots, so it's got French oak barrels in it. It's got bourbon barrels and virgin brand new oak barrels in it. It is a 12-year-old whiskey, and part of the blend too, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but it's like a 2.4 or 2 was his goals against average. So that's what we blended in as the rye level into his whiskey. And what I must say about Martin, he sat there, he was involved in what he liked, what he wanted, and we wanted to bring towards a whiskey that met his personal taste profile. We did set the whiskey at 47% ABV, and I gotta believe that might have been his career shutouts.
The Martin Brodeur edition will go on sale first in Quebec this fall and later throughout Canada. There's no word yet on pricing, but proceeds from the Alumni Series releases go to the NHL Alumni Association's fund that helps retired players who did not make a lot of money during their careers and need assistance today. Meanwhile, it's been a couple of years since Hall of Fame goalie Ed Belfour released the first Belfour Spirits whiskies that he created with his son and daughter. Now the family is releasing a new small batch straight bourbon. They distilled the whiskey 3 years ago at Southern Distilling in North Carolina with a wheated bourbon recipe and put away 95 barrels for this release. It'll be available in 12 U.S. states. There's no word on pricing. Finally, I mentioned the farewell appearance for Jim McEwen last time around. Jim is retiring for good this time after 58 years of making whiskey and is working with Dramfool, the German publisher of his new memoir, A Journeyman's Journey, and the producers of the Water of Life Scotch Whisky documentary, to say his goodbyes on May 23rd. The film's director, Greg Swartz, joined us on the Happy Hour Live webcast Friday night.
Jim came to us and said, it was time to step away. I think the last year, he hasn't seen his grandchildren in a year. And I think that really kind of made him reevaluate, his life right now. And he said, he wants to be a full-time husband and grandfather for the rest of his life. And it was just time to step away. And he wanted to do a farewell event. And so we're going to do a thing called A Last Chat with Jim McEwen. It's just going to be, a live, fun Q&A, questions, stories. We have a couple of surprises for Jim that he doesn't know about. So I'm hoping he doesn't see this. Or even if he does, I'm not going to say what they are right now. He wanted to do something, and he wanted to do it for charity. And he came to us with the idea of doing it for Scotland's charity air ambulance, which is what it sounds like. It's helicopters that serve as ambulances between the Hebrides Islands and the mainland of Scotland. And he really wanted to do something to raise money for them. So we agreed, Dramfool, our film, and the publisher agreed to, build this event as a fundraiser for them. And we, couldn't be more honored to be part of this, to be part of the last thing that Jim does publicly. And I do really believe he's quite serious about it this time.
While there are still some companion tasting kits available through Dramfool, they've also decided to open up tickets worldwide to join the farewell chat. Part of the $20 ticket price will also be donated to Scotland's charity air ambulance service. We have a link for more details in the show notes for this episode at WhiskyCast.com. Of course, that's where you can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long. Join us this Friday night, 5 p.m. New York time, for our weekly Happy Hour Live webcast. You can catch the fun on the WhiskyCast YouTube channel, along with our Facebook page, Twitter, and Twitch. If you missed last Friday night's webcast with Phil McDaniel, Becky Harris, and Greg Swartz, or any of our past webcasts, they're always available on demand at our YouTube channel. Time now for the calendar of events brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling. The Taipei Whiskey Club has a meetup and tasting this Wednesday night in Taipei, Taiwan. The Spirit of Toronto Festival's Discovery Series of virtual tastings wraps up this week with a Jura tasting Wednesday night, Aberfeldy and Craigellachie on Thursday, the Delmore on Friday, Gordon and MacPhail Saturday, and Loch Lomond Whiskies on Sunday. The Our Whiskey Virtual Festival continues this Thursday with a Rising Tide tasting of Rise. In Australia, the Whiskey Show Sydney is this coming Friday and Saturday, while Manly Spirits in Sydney has a Make-Your-Own Whiskey blending class on Saturday. Our friends at Whiskey Galore in Christchurch, New Zealand, have a Suntory whiskey tasting coming up on May 20th. And Ardbeg's Monsters of Smoke bus tour has stops in South Florida through next week. Those are just a few of the 163 live and virtual events on our searchable calendar at WhiskyCast.com. The calendar of events is brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling, makers of the Virginia Rye Whiskey. You'll find their Roundstone Rye at fine whiskey shops in 26 U.S. states and 3 continents, and online too. Visit the Where to Buy page at CatoctinCreekDistilling.com to find a retailer near you. And please drink responsibly.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Small batch. How would you describe it? It's like an Irishman's understanding of baseball. Extremely limited.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Oban. How can you tell whether a whiskey is the real thing or a cleverly designed fake? The latest controversy over counterfeit whiskeys came this week when the tabloid TV show Inside Edition ran a story on a faked bottle of Buffalo Trace's E.H. Taylor 4-grain bourbon. One of the show's producers bought the bottle from Acker Wines in New York City for $1,000 after being assured that the bottle was genuine. The show sent that bottle back to Kentucky, where Buffalo Trace technical director John Medley found several problems with it. There was no lot code on the bottle, the strip stamp was put on backwards, and a lab analysis of the whiskey inside the bottle showed that the proof was wrong. So Medley deemed the bottle a fake. Acker Wines spokesman told Food and Wine magazine that several months ago they had questions about the authenticity of a batch of E.H. Taylor 4-grain whiskeys that they had acquired from a collector. And not only did they pull all of the bottles still on the shelf, but they also issued a recall to purchasers who had already bought a bottle. Every purchaser but one returned their bottle to Acker. The one who didn't refused to provide contact information, and they believe that was the Inside Edition bottle. While whiskey makers routinely put lot codes on their bottles, there's usually no way for consumers to be able to decipher those codes to find out more about when and how the whiskey was made. That could be changing, thanks to the encryption technology behind Bitcoin, NFTs, and other cryptocurrencies. It's called blockchain, and in addition to finding other uses in the financial, manufacturing, and aerospace industries, blockchain has now come to whiskey. Chris Ratcliff breaks the code behind blockchain for us, and while the technology may be complicated, the concept itself is simple.
The concept is simple. If you've ever been to an older whiskey distillery, you will have seen paper ledgers next to the stills or washbacks where those involved in the production write down details of their work, like when a fermentation was started or what the alcoholic strength was at the start or end of a distillation run. This information, along with everything else in the supply chain from the grain batch to the barrel locations, is stored and is important to the distillery. This means good and less good batches can be monitored and faults found and understood. It's also important to keep track of your spirit runs and inventory for tax purposes. Many distilleries use computer databases already to record and track this information. So what makes blockchain different? Think back to those paper ledgers. If a distillery worker signs their name next to an entry, then that signature can be verified in the future. Similarly, if the pages in the book are numbered, then if someone tries to tamper with the book in the future, and those page numbers are no longer sequential, then it may be evidence that the information has been falsified. Blockchain works on the same principle. When information is added by a specific individual, that information is run through an encryption process and a string of letters and numbers, or what's called a hash, is produced. This is used to create a digital signature for that information, which may be a distillery operation, an individual bottle, or a batch of grain arriving at the site, and added to a digital ledger. That ledger can verify that each entry has not been tampered with, and that the continuity of those entries, or the virtual equivalent of ripping a page out of a book, has been preserved. The information entered into a blockchain is intended to be permanent, undeletable, and verifiably correct. And this is what is attracting companies to start looking at blockchain for supply chains that need this level of evidence. Blockchain and computer databases are nothing new, but allowing whiskey drinkers the ability to see how their bottle of whiskey was made is. Distilleries are now starting to put a public face on their production records so a bottle purchase can reveal when it was made, how long it was matured for, and what casks went into the bottle. Alex Bruce is the managing director for Adelphi. His team implemented blockchain at its Ardnamurchan distillery, which released its first whiskies in 2020.
Obviously, I'd heard about it in the distance, in terms of cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin, things like that. But it never really appealed to me. And it wasn't until about 2016, I think, that it was part of a presentation to the Scotland Food and Drink Board here to showcase its use in food traceability. And I think the example given from memory was basically pig to pork chop. So as a consumer, you could potentially scan a pork chop in your supermarket. And if you wanted to, trace it right back to Mildred the pig and the farmer's name and all the rest of it. It sounds pretty gory, but it just kind of clicked. And I thought, well, hang on, let's have a discussion on whiskey. And funnily enough, one of the questions that day to the people who were pitching was, that's all very well, but who regulates the information? Who's the judge? Who's verifying it? And they said, well, that's one of its potential downfalls, because unless you have lots of people all contributing to that node, that ledger where you hold your information, even though it's incorruptible information, it could potentially be falsified at the source. So the farmer could have said his name was Bob, when in fact it was Jim. And as far as the blockchain is concerned, it would remain as Bob. But for whiskey, and this is where it really appealed to me, we are judged, everything we do has to be verified by Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, HMRC. So they are our natural verification. So the information has to be correct, basically.
And there's a lot of information. You sent me a bottle code before we had this interview, and looking through, it's details about who fermented it, when it was fermented, what the hydrometer readings were at the start of the run, at the end of the run, all of this sort of information. So put us onto the production line. When this is actually being produced, who puts this information into the system? How is it recorded? What actual steps do you go through to put this information into your ledger?
Yeah, so at the moment, while we're trialing, we're still building the system. Like anything, blockchain, it grows arms and legs. But no, while we're trialing it, we are doing a dual copy. So traditionally, a distillery operator, whether they were receiving in malted barley into the silos, or whether they were doing the mill, the mash, the fermentation, yeast adding, distillation run, filling a cask, all these steps, they would document on a spreadsheet, a piece of paper. And that information then would then be passed to the production manager, who would then submit what we call the W1 form to HMRC. And you would have to prove between the W1 and I think it's a W21, without getting too technical, you would have to prove that the yield of malted barley coming in was equivalent within certain parameters to the yield of spirit you got out at the other end. And that way, there's no way you could have been cheating it by hiving off a little bit of alcohol for yourselves. So at the moment, we do the paperwork as we always have done, but we also, the operators are also keying in the same information to a template on an iPad or a tablet. And that is electronically going directly live into our ledger for processing and storage.
So what parts of the process do you record at the moment, and where do you see it being extended to in the kind of immediate future? What are the next steps you've got in your head that you want to capture in there?
So at the moment, it is purely production. It's the moment something arrives on site, and all the way through to when it is filled into cask, right down to where the cask is then placed in which warehouse. And that information, to me, actually, as one of the blenders at the other end, is actually quite key, because it allows me to then keep an eye on maturing stocks and how each part of each different warehouse is potentially affecting maturation. So it's almost giving us a jump start on a distiller that's been going for hundreds of years. We've only been going for 7, but we've already built a colour map of our distillery maturation warehouses. So that on-site at the distillery is all being mapped, if you like, all being put into the ledger. And then we also have a very simplified version down at the bottling hall here in Fife, which is, so the casks come down in a lorry, we vat them depending on the recipe for that particular batch, and they then upload their information, and that's added to the information of all bottlers. So the bottling date, the bottling name, and so on. So that's captured as well. Going beyond this sort of first phase, if you like, we want to start to capture the supply chain of the raw materials coming into the distillery and the dry goods, the manufacture of bottles and cardboard and all the rest of it to our warehouse. And ideally persuade each of our suppliers to independently upload their information to our ledger. So I'm not going to go, we bought 10 casks from Manuel in Spain. I'm going to get Manuel to go, we supplied 10 casks to Adelphi, and this is what they were. So that's the next step. And then the final step is to potentially then cover the logistics. So scan the orders as they go out on a pallet to Germany, for example, scan them in at the other end. And then that way we've also covered everything, to the final point.
So at the moment, if somebody picks up a bottle that is on the blockchain, it has gone through this process, is that QR code, because I think there's either a QR code you can scan or there's a code on the bottle, is that unique to the bottle or is that unique to the batch of bottles?
So we're using QR codes at the moment, as you mentioned. They're just simply the mechanism for the consumer to interact. There are other more expensive methods available, but the QR code is the simplest to us. And yes, every single bottle has a different QR code number. So technically, each bottle is digitally encrypted. And so when the consumer scans it, it will come up with their own bottle number. And that's it pretty much for life, to be honest.
Wow. And what has the customer reaction been to this? How many people are actually engaging with this, and what sort of feedback have you had on it?
So it's been a gradual process. As we've been building it, we've also been trying to educate and get feedback. The education part is trying to, without boring people, because I'm obviously very aware that when we're doing a whiskey tasting, probably 80% of the room is there for the whiskey and not to be told how blockchain works. So it's more about trying to talk about it in layman's terms, trying to make it a very friendly way of getting information that they want out of each bottle. So that education process has been going on now for the last 3, almost 4 years. Meanwhile, we've also been developing our end. And one of the things we're working on at the moment, which hopefully should be live really by the end of the summer this year, is an actual app. So they will have the opportunity, having scanned the bottle, to download a specific app for us for this blockchain. And once they've got that, it then becomes completely interactive. So they'll be able to punch in their tasting notes, their individual, what they got of the whiskey. They'll be able to show their own collection, like a virtual kind of cellar, if you like, which they can keep and all the rest of it. And we then start to be able to get the full extent of the interaction with the consumer out of it. But that's always been the icing on the cake, that part. For us, the most important part is getting the system to work for our production and our supply. And then everything else stems from that, if you like.
We're obviously at a point now where whiskey has always been quite one-sided, I think, with a lot of marketing. But if you're able to interact directly with the customers and you're able to see what they're buying, what they're tasting, can you see things like, for example, if one person has a lot of bottles, if people are, even if they're reselling them or if they're coming up for auction, is that something that the blockchain and that archive and that record that you've got, can that start to become useful in that respect as well?
So I think there's always going to be a thin line between useful information gathering, generic, if you like, and crossing over into GDPR territory. Because obviously, unless the consumer specifically allows it, we would never ask for the details of, their collection or whatever. What it does allow us at the moment, without any consumer physical interaction, if you like, with us, assuming they're scanning the bottle, with something like a phone. So most, iPhones or equivalent are GPS enabled. And if that's turned on, which normally it is, we will then be able to pick up where that bottle was scanned within, a few miles. Now, what we don't know is if that scanning then completed a sale, if you like, and resulted in a sale or a take-home purchase or something else. It may just been in a bar or whatever. But it does give us an indication of, A, where the bottles have been scanned, and we can build up a nice little picture there. And B, importantly for us, it allows us, if we want to track any potential parallel trading. So I will know, once we have the logistics part finalized, we will know where every single bottle number was destined for. And we can then see, look, someone scanned one in Berlin, but that number went to Spain. So what's going on here? And we can then have conversations with our importers and distributors as well. Going forward, in terms of protecting the consumer or attempting to protect the consumer at third-party level, so auctions, things like that, it's quite possible that we could introduce another hidden code on the bottle through a chip, maybe in the capsule or whatever technology provides in the future. And these codes could be linked from day one on the bottling line. And if one is tampered with, i.e. opening a bottle, then it will tell the other one, I have been opened. The interaction will break, and therefore, when you scan the bottle, it will go, this bottle's been opened. If it's filled with a new capsule on it, it's a fake, usually. So it's kind of, there's a what-if scenario situation where we could potentially almost guarantee authentication of each bottle.
And I suppose now, when we're looking at these increasingly high-end bottles, where we've got blown glass decanters and we've got special labels and all that sort of thing, to have the provenance, to be able to say to somebody, this is when it was produced, this is where it was shipped to, these are the auctions potentially, I guess, that it's been through, and you can verify whether it's even been opened or not. From an auction point of view, I imagine that would be huge.
You would have thought so, and it's a balancing act of trying to keep the whole thing as simple as possible, whether it be the technology or the consumer interaction and how they access the information. Because, some of the arms and legs that have appeared on the radar in terms of being able to authenticate bottles have been as detailed as things like you should do a water analysis on the original hill water, which we do anyway. But if that analysis is then put into the blockchain ledger, then potentially at the other end, in 100 years' time, when this bottle appears on an auction for the 15th time or whatever, an analysis of the water element of the whiskey could be taken and tracked back to that original input into the ledger. But that, to me, is too complicated. It involves too many scientific operations, technical operations by third parties that you then have to trust as well. So what I'm trying to do is develop something which is so simple, allow the blockchain to do its bit of proving incorruptibility, and all the other bits, the technological bits, are there to aid this interaction and authenticity and everything.
There's been a large push within certain areas of the whisky industry around transparency for things like blends, but also for what goes into single malt bottlings as well. The example that you gave me is incredibly transparent. How do you balance that desire for transparency with the rules of disclosure to your customers?
So there aren't actually many rules of disclosure. The only one that becomes a slight sticking point and is open for debate is around the law actually reads the promotion of the youngest age. So you're only allowed to promote the youngest age of any blend or any whiskey, basically. Now, my take on promotion is that it's all to do with the marketing of and it all kind of stemmed, I'm not going to mention any names because we probably know them, but it all stemmed from blenders maybe in the last century, towards the end of the last century, who were coming out with a 50-year-old blend which contained 99%, say, 10-year-old and 1% 50-year-old, a teaspoon of 50-year-old. So it was the wrong way round. And this law was brought in to protect that and to allow the consumer some kind of faith in the fact that the product was at least the age it was stated, rather than the other way around. Now, however, with something like blockchain, by being fully transparent and saying, if you scan one of our other American bottles, you get a list of every single cask that was put into that batch. And by showing that, we're not promoting, we're simply detailing the same information that we give to HMRC. So my take on it is that it's there as a transparency, not as a promotion. We're not trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes at all. We're being completely the opposite. So that's where we are at the moment. In terms of other stuff, in terms of how we make our whiskey and things like that, I'm not particularly worried because I'm a great believer in a style of flavour coming from the place more than anything else. And our maturation is all on site. We are the only people to have a distillery there. So we, in theory, have this unique style protected just by nature. So yeah, I'm not particularly concerned about that.
It is important to say that under GDPR, for example, any interaction with a consumer that records their data must be strictly opt-in and only record the data that is required. Privacy controls in smartphones also mean data like GPS can be made available to apps, but also restricted if the consumer wishes. While the idea of being able to track if a bottle has been opened and use that data to vary the customer experience is an interesting one, it's also important to point out that if you buy and open the bottle and don't scan it, then nothing will be shared with the distillery at all. I reached out to the Scotch Whisky Association on the sharing of cask details. A spokesperson for the SWA said, and I quote, UK and EU law requires that the labelling, description and promotion of any spirit, including Scotch whisky, should only provide the age of the youngest component in the spirit. Apart from age, detailed information about the origin and ingredients of the whisky can be shared. The Scotch Whisky Association is always happy to field queries in confidence on whether a product is being labelled or presented lawfully. Adelphi are not the only whisky makers using blockchain. William Grant & Sons are exploring the technology and have released a blockchain expression of El Sabay, which similarly uses production data to show the consumer how it was made. William Grant & Sons could not be reached for comment on their future plans for the technology. When bottles of whisky come up for auction, questions of provenance and authenticity are often at the front of both auctioneers' and customers' minds. I asked Joe Wilson, head of auction content for Whisky Auctioneer, what he looks for to verify a bottle of whisky.
So the first thing that we do is to, you always have to have a kind of certain suspicion with everything that comes in, just for the sake of keeping the market safe, first and foremost. It's one of the things that everybody wants to talk to you about when they hear what you do for a living. And I think it sounds like quite a glamorous part of the job, but that couldn't really be any further from the truth. Like, what we do is very much based on just an endless accumulation of data. We're in an incredibly fortunate position, particularly at Whisky Auctioneer, that we see, between kind of 7,000 and 9,000 bottles a month, which is, more than most people will see of any type of whisky in their, on a monthly basis, and maybe even in some cases in their lifetime. We're in this great position where we can chart the presentation of a bottle from, the liquid that's inside to the way that the labels are presented, any kind of unusual quirks or kind of esoteric elements within the labeling or the capsule and the seals. One of the most important things that we do is that we sell sealed bottles. And when you talk to maybe the more kind of old school collectors and things like that, their verification methods are invariably, you just have to open it and try it. That's the only way to know. And we can't do that. And I said, there must be another way for us to be able to do that, because that's our job and we have to find a better way to do it. So, I embarked on this process of just digitizing and recording as much information as possible so that we can actually see, by referring to a database of every Macallan that we've sold, whether the one that we have in our possession now matches all of the details that are supposed to match. And by that method, you can be fairly certain that what you're selling is either counterfeit or something that you need to reject from the auction.
So looking forward then to these new technologies, these advancements that are making bottles more traceable and giving more of a story and a provenance to the bottle, what would that do to the way that you approach a bottle of whisky?
I mean, it's something that is is very interesting to us, and I think it would be something that we would implement within our authentication procedure. It doesn't sound, certainly in the near future, like something that is going to be a foolproof method of authenticating something. I think one of the beautiful things about whiskey as like a secondary market investment piece is that it is quite tactile, and it's something that you can engage in more than, say, stocks and shares. Like if you decide that you want to open a whiskey and enjoy it, you're welcome to do that. In order to have a completely secure and encrypted kind of record of ownership, you'd have to get to a kind of point where some wine collectors are, where things just stay in bond forever, and you trade the ownership, but the whiskey never moves around. And whiskey's a great thing to have. It's a showpiece in your home. You can have it on display. You can take it out and show it around, things like that. And that's one of the things that I think people are drawn to and find it like an accessible thing to engage in, particularly in the auction market. And once you have sold that bottle from a retailer, you have to have everybody on board with where these whiskies are going, and everybody has to keep this record up to date. And even then, you have to be sure that the whiskey has been kept in the same condition, because somebody could bring me a bottle of whiskey and say, here's the digital certificate proving where it's been, where it's from. I would still have to do my checks to make sure that bottle hadn't been opened and refilled and resealed. So, I think knowledge will always be the most important factor. And I think this would absolutely help, and it'd be a very useful thing in the future for people to have. But certainly, there is a lot more work to do. And, we're always learning, we're always gathering information, and we will continue to do so to ensure that we keep, the market as safe for consumers as possible.
While blockchain is a modern version of the records that have gone before, the ability now to open up production information for each bottle to whiskey drinkers and give a full provenance of that bottle could lead to many exciting developments in the future. For WhiskyCast, I'm Chris Ratcliff.
That's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Oban and the entire Classic Malts lineup. Every sip of Oban is like a postcard. Oban Single Malt Scotch Whiskey is offering you the chance to immerse yourself in Oban and the whiskey-making process through the Oban Abode experience. 2 winners will receive a trip to Scotland to stay in the Oban Abode, located just steps from the distillery. To learn more and enter, visit obanabode.obanwhiskey.com. You'll find complete rules at the website. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. Let's start off with the new George Dickel Bottled in Bond Tennessee whiskey that we heard about during the news. Once again, it's a 13-year-old whiskey distilled during the spring of 2007, and, of course, is bottled at 50% ABV. The nose is fruity and ripe with cherries, orange peel, a hint of apricots, honey, and toasted oak. The taste has subtle spicy touches of cinnamon and allspice that complement fruity notes of cherries, red apples, and orange peel, while hints of honey and oak in the background pull it all together. The finish is long and well-balanced with a nice fruity character. I'm scoring the 2021 release of George Dickel Bottled in Bond a 93. Next up, let's look at Black Button Distilling's 4-grain straight bourbon. Black Button is located in Rochester, New York, and used New York-grown corn, wheat, rye, and malted barley for this 2-year-old whiskey. It's bottled at 42% ABV, and the nose has a nice honeycomb and brown sugar sweetness, along with touches of anise, butterscotch, and vanilla. The taste has those honeycomb and brown sugar notes, balanced by a touch of cinnamon, a nice maltiness in the background, and hints of anise and toasted oak. The finish, long, aromatic, and well-balanced. I'm scoring Black Button's 4-grain straight bourbon a 91. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit, the award-winning rye whiskey distillery based in Baltimore, Maryland. Try their signature cask and double oak rye whiskies, each a proprietary blend of high and low rye mash bills. Sagamore Spirit has mastered the transformational art of blending. Learn more at sagamorespirit.com. Please drink responsibly. Amrut's Bagheera is an Indian single malt finished in ex-sherry casks. It's bottled at 46% ABV. The nose on my sample has a hint of toffee along with barley sugar, subtle spices and oakiness, orange peel, and dried fruits. The taste has a nice bite of orange bitters along with dried fruits, subtle spices, and hints of toffee and brown sugar. The finish, long and gentle, with dried fruits and a subtle spiciness. I'm scoring Amrut Bagheera a 92. Finally, I received a sample the other day of the Whiskey Exchange's exclusive bottling of a Glenfarclas 15-year-old single malt at the Old British 100 degrees proof, or 57.1% ABV. The nose has classic Glenfarclas sherry cask notes of raisins, plums, honey, and dried flowers, along with touches of wet leather and pipe tobacco. The taste is spicy, but still well balanced between cinnamon and allspice, with raisins, plums, and a hint of apricots. The finish fades away gently with a nice balance. I'm scoring the Whiskey Exchange's exclusive Glenfarclas 15-year-old a 93. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. I'll be adding these whiskeys to our searchable list of more than 3,100 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at WhiskyCast.com.
After 175 years in business, Dewar's could rest on its laurels. But we've always believed in staying curious and pushing boundaries. Which brings us to Portuguese Smooth, the brainchild of our award-winning master blender, Stephanie McLeod. Port Smooth is a quality blend of 8-year-old Scotch finished in real ruby port barrels for a rich, complex spirit with notes of red cherries, creamy vanilla, and honeydew melon. It's like no other Scotch on the market, and you can find it right now at a store near you.
Let's open up the inbox now for your voice. A couple of weeks ago, I shared my tasting notes for Counterfeit Distilleries' first single malt release, the 2017 Legacy Series. This weekend, during the hashtag Saturday Night Sip meetup on Twitter, Brian Volker, here in New Jersey, posted this note about his bottle. Joining in with a drop of Counterfeit, very strong inaugural release and excited to see what the future holds for them. As am I, Brian. Doug Ross at DougRoss01 on Twitter had this comment on the farewell chat with Jim McEwen that's coming up May 23rd. He's earned the right to retire as often and whenever he wants. We're all enjoying his lifetime of devotion to the industry. Many have gone before, but fewer will go hereafter. Enjoy each occasion. And Donald Hanna echoed that comment in this tweet. The Frank Sinatra of the whiskey world. We stayed in the cooperage in Port Charlotte a few years back, looking at his many awards on the walls while talking to his wife Barbara about him. I think I summed it up well enough by saying he's a rock star. Well, Jim certainly does it his way. If there is something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always get in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and other things that make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. And this week, we might just make some people mad, because we're going to talk about the neck pour. No, it's not when one holds a bottle by the neck and pours the whiskey into their mouth. It's also not when you accidentally spill some whiskey on your neck while taking a drink. No, it's much, much worse than that. You see, there are some people out there who believe that the whiskey in the neck of a bottle gets tainted by exposure to air in what's called the headspace, that part of the bottle between the top of the liquid and the cork or a screw cap. So, they pour out the first inch or two of whiskey from a brand new bottle down the drain. Let that sink in for a minute. After spending their hard-earned money on an expensive bottle of whiskey, they throw part of it away because of a myth. And that's all it is, a myth. Last month, I waded into a discussion about neck pours on Twitter and promptly called bullshit. Since then, I've asked several longtime distillers about the neck pour myth, and these are people with degrees in chemical engineering who know a thing or two about fluid dynamics, the way liquids like whiskey move. Not only had most of them never heard of the neck pour, the very idea seemed ludicrous. Here's my conversation with Cascade Hollow's Nicole Austin.
It's like the funny things that whiskey folks will come up with. And, I hate to make fun because it was not that long ago that I was like so excited with all the new information that I had gleaned about whiskey and really, was just so excited to tell the whole world about it. So I try and have a little empathy, but sometimes it's got to make you laugh, right? You're like, really? Like, how do you imagine that that's happening?
So let's explain why it doesn't happen. First, it spends more time in contact with air inside the barrel than it ever would in a bottle.
100%. Oak is porous by definition. That's why maturation happens. To be fair, not to say, of course, continued prolonged contact with, if you left a bottle around for years and years, absolutely changes would continue, which is its own delightful controversy. But I thought the essence of the neck pour nonsense was the idea that somehow whiskey at the top of the bottle is going to be different than, but when you pour it out, how are you maintaining perfectly laminar separation in the process of tilting a whiskey bottle? I don't see it.
Logically, if this were true, then you wouldn't be able to have the whiskey in the back of the car coming home from the store because it's going to get shaken up on the road. If it's in a truck being hauled from the distillery to the wholesaler and then to the retailer.
I mean, the mere act of you...
Yeah, the fact that it's banging around.
It's to pour out of it. I was thinking the only way you could ever possibly prove this is even vaguely true would be to perfectly syringe out of two different depths. If you left a bottle sitting for months and let it settle, and then you syringed out of the top and the bottom, there's I would say, remote possibility to go full Mythbuster style that maybe you could blind nose the difference between those two. But even if you could, you're never going to replicate who's syringing their whiskey out of the bottle at home and why? Why are you doing that?
It doesn't make a bit of sense to me. I mean, it's just, why would you throw the top inch of whiskey away from any bottle? It's just a waste.
I mean, I guess as a whiskey maker, I'm first of all, that just makes me sad, because it's not what I made it for. And also, don't put whiskey down the drain because it's a very high BOD and your wastewater treatment plants are not designed for that. It's meant to be drank. Just, that is what it's for.
Here's a way you can disprove this theory at home. Take an empty whiskey bottle and fill it up with water to about an inch or so below where that bottle would have been when new. Compare it against a new bottle just to be sure. Then you can take some cooking oil and add it to the bottle to bring it up to the fill level. Of course, the oil will float on top of the water after a few minutes, and for the purposes of our experiment, it'll simulate the whiskey at the top of a new bottle. As you pour from that bottle into a glass, you'll see the oil shift back into the bottle as water from below flows underneath it into your glass. There will be some oily residue in the glass, but almost all of that so-called neck pour will be water. And it works the same way with whiskey. That is science, gang, not a myth. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot, a rare style of Irish whiskey with a creative twist. A unique triple distilled blend of single pot still and single malt premium Irish whiskies. Writer's Tears Copper Pot. Do you dare to be creative?
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and of course a complete archive of all of our past episodes, all the way back to 2005. We love to hear from you. You can always get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Ever go out drinking with a peacock? Always the same. Few too many, tail feathers come out, drinks get knocked over, bartender's not happy, night's over before it started. All I'm saying is, don't be the peacock in your group.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
This episode of WhiskyCast is finished. You know, like Dewar's Portuguese Smooth is finished in ruby port barrels. Alright, so that wasn't the smoothest segue, but it is remarkably smooth to drink. Curious? Try it. You'll see.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2021, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening, and please stay safe.